So hello everyone. Welcome to the virtual launching of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. And I would like to give you just a few instructions before we formally start the webinar. So I'm Manja Bayang. I'm the current global operations for the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. And we will be using the English language for this webinar. We will start with brief presentations from 4 speakers. And this will be followed by an open forum at the end of all the presentations. But during the course of the presentations, all participants may type their questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We are also live streaming this on Facebook in the IPRI Facebook account, and we will be screening and consolidating all the comments and the questions and relay them to our speakers who will respond to them during the open forum. Also during the open forum, participants may also request to speak, and you can do this by clicking the raise your hand button during the open forum, and you will then be granted access to the microphone. During the whole duration though, I would like to request all participants to remain muted and not to interrupt the speakers while they are making the presentations. And for the speakers, please speak directly to your camera to establish eye contact with the participants. So we are almost about to start. I will be introducing the speakers as they speak. Our first speaker today is Vicky Victoria Taolicorpos. She is from the Philippines, and she's an indigenous activist from the Oecd people of the Cordilleras, which is north of the Philippines. She's a social development consultant, a civic leader, human rights expert, public servant, and an advocate of women's rights. And as an indigenous activist, she actively engaged in the drafting of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She served as the chairperson of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and she just recently concluded her term as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She is also the executive director of Tubtuba Foundation, the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education. And she has founded and managed various NGOs that are involved in the social awareness raising, climate change, and advancement of Indigenous peoples and women's rights. So Vicky will have 10 minutes to do her presentation.
Thank you very much, Manja, and thank you to all who are participating in this virtual lounge. We would have wanted to do this in a physically in a face-to-face basis, but with the COVID situation, we now have to do it this way. Mine is to just present a little history of how Indigenous Peoples Rights International has been established, and the campaign, the campaign against, the global campaign against criminalization and violence against indigenous peoples. So last year, or even several years before that, in 2018, as the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I made a report, a special thematic report on the situation of criminalization against indigenous peoples. And what I have seen in the study was very alarming, because in many countries, including the rich countries, there are several cases of indigenous peoples facing trumped-up charges or being brought to jail under false charges and being incarcerated for long times, even during pre-detention. No, and I have been receiving communications from all over the world of the victims. I even received handwritten letters asking me to support them in their bid to seek freedom from being put in jail. And in the country visits that I have done, I've met with the indigenous people who are victims of this. So these are either individuals, usually these are leaders or activists, the indigenous people's rights defenders, who have been very visible in the fight against the grabbing of their lands and natural resources, as well as in asserting their right to be consulted whenever projects are being brought to their communities. And what I have seen in many cases, it's usually these kinds of actions, these acts of criminalization and violence, when usually they are also attacked in their communities. This is not just addressing the individual, it's also communities. So it's both an individual rights violation as well as a violation of the collective rights of indigenous peoples to to, to association as well as to the right to self-determination. And in many of the cases that I have seen, the process is usually common. It's there's a common a pattern wherein indigenous leaders and activists are smeared. No, there are flyers usually being sent around, or there are social media posts which demonizes them, vilifies them, puts them as identifies them as either terrorists or as people with undesirable character. And then the next step that you will see is usually there are charges that are filed against them in the courts. And then when these charges are filed, usually they get arrested, and then they are brought to court, and they are not provided any lawyers, and they are put in jail for indefinite periods of time unless somebody else really goes and takes care of their issues. In many cases, there are usually there is an absence of lawyers who will support them. You know, big organizations sometimes will have the capacity to get lawyers to defend these people who are criminalized, but in a lot of cases, there are no lawyers at all. So this is the common trend that I have seen in my stint as the UN Special Rapporteur from 2000 for the past 6 years. I just ended my term in April 30 of this year. And it was alarming for me because the UN system, while you have a special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, the responses that we can provide are not adequate at all. No, because we don't engage, of course, in doing global campaigns. The UN doesn't support lawyers, no, to go and deal with these issues. Fact-finding missions. For instance, quick reaction teams cannot be organized by the UN to go and look at the situation of indigenous peoples who were forcibly displaced or where violence has been committed against them. And so this brought me to the idea that maybe there is a need for an organization or an institution that will be focusing solely on this, because unless we have a systematic program to address this situation, we will have a lot of our colleagues being finding themselves in these situations. Even me as the special rapporteur, has been a victim of this kind of criminalization. Joanne Carling, who will be speaking soon, and myself, we were included in a list of 600 so-called terrorists by the Philippine government. It was through a very systematic campaign that finally the government decided to remove that list, but it took more than a year for them to take that act. But you know, that kind of experience has really is really an indication of the extent of what corporations and governments do to stop the decent and the active assertion of the rights of indigenous peoples. No, so this concept was evolving. We were talking about it. We had several meetings in the UN during the Permanent Forum on the Rights of Indigenous People on indigenous issues last year, also in the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. And we presented the initial ideas, and we got a lot of support from many indigenous peoples who were attending those meetings. And this led towards the effort to generate resources for this to be set up. So mainly the objectives of this Indigenous Peoples Rights International is to respond and to reduce and prevent acts of criminalization of and violence against indigenous peoples, no, and to increase the visibility of this reality. The problem is, this is not visible at all. There are some reports that come every now and then, but no systematic monitoring and therefore less visibility. Secondly, to address the impunity of those who attack indigenous peoples. What I have seen also is that those perpetrators usually are not brought to justice, and so they continue to commit these kinds of crimes, no? And this is the thing that that allows for the continuing criminalization of indigenous people. So the second objective is to address this issue, the culture of impunity that exists in many countries, and to strengthen the capacities of indigenous peoples and human rights defenders to bring them to justice. Third, it is to provide protection and access to justice for actual and potential victims, again, not only as individuals, but as collectives. We have seen that one of the weaknesses of some existing human rights organizations is that they deal only with individual rights, no? So they deal with the rights of a person who has been imprisoned unjustly, but they don't look at the collective rights of peoples, no? So they don't deal with collectives or communities, and this is going to be one distinct characteristic of this organization that we are setting up. And finally, it's to coordinate and lead a global campaign to address impunity, the violence against and criminalization of indigenous peoples. So this is the idea. The idea is that if we have an institution, a system that addresses this in a more sustained and systematic manner, then maybe we will be able to prevent the situation of criminalization and also lessen the violence being committed against indigenous peoples. We will be able to make this issue highly visible, and we will be able to mobilize more people who will understand this situation and provide the support that these people and communities need. And thirdly, we will be able to also put up resources that will ensure that some indigenous peoples who need the legal support will be able to have access. So we have a legal defense fund, and we also have a sanctuary fund, because sometimes indigenous people, you have to either extract them from their communities, at least the leaders, so that it will protect them from being killed, or you have to put up a sanctuary where they can go instead of them being displaced in the most hostile places, no? So this is the way that this initiative, this initiative and campaign is going to be done. And we wanted to launch this officially during the April session of the Permanent Forum, but since that's not happening, we are doing it this way. And so we had just finished the board meeting. We have a global board that was organized, and this IPRI is now legally registered in the Philippines under the Securities and Exchange Commission of the Philippines, and our vision is that eventually it will also be registered in another country, maybe in Geneva or in New York, no? But that's something that we're still working on. So I think with that background, we can move on to the next speakers, because there is a lot to share in relation to this exciting initiative, in which we are really getting a lot of very good feedback from indigenous peoples and leaders all over the world. Just this morning, I had a conversation with Oecd, which is the formation of indigenous peoples in the Amazon in Colombia, and they were very happy to be part of the process, because we have also identified that there will be 6 pilot countries where we will put a more focused attention. And these countries are Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, the Philippines, Democratic Republic of Congo, and India. And the reason why these countries were selected is because this is where we find the highest levels of criminalization and violence against indigenous peoples. lessening this kind of situation, then maybe there is we will be able to learn more lessons, and we will be able to address the needs of others. It will address the whole world, but we just identified these pilot countries for the start. So thank you very much, and I hope we will be able to get a lot of support from all the various stakeholders on the issue of protecting the human rights of indigenous peoples.
Of the establishment of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. And also following Vicky will be Joanne. She will be sharing with us updates and the state of affairs of Indigenous, who are the organization is at now. Joanne is an Indigenous activist from the Cordillera with more than 20 years of working on Indigenous issues from the grassroots to the international level. Her expertise includes areas like human rights, sustainable development, the environment, climate change, and additionally, the application of free, prior, and informed consent. She was the Secretary General of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact from 2008 to 2016, and was appointed as Indigenous expert of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues between 2014 and 2016. She was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the UN Environment in 2018. And Joanne is currently the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development and also the co-director of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, along with Vicky as the second co-director. So Joanne, you have the floor.
Thank you, Manja. I just want to add a bit more on Vicky in terms of the components of this initiative, the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. So one of the major undertaking of IPRI is also the establishment of a global database on the criminalization of indigenous peoples. And this has already been, it's being set up and will be finalized, so that we can put in a database all the reported and documented cases. And from that data, we will be issuing an annual report on the state of criminalization and impunity against indigenous peoples. And this will be done. We actually made the first one in December, when we also launched the website of IPRI, where we had the report for 2009. And later in my presentation, I will be sharing the mid-year report on the state of criminalization, or I would rather say the worsening criminalization of indigenous peoples under COVID this year. So that's another component, the annual report, and probably also mid-year report. Vicky has mentioned the periodic national focus countries, and I will provide some updates on how we are progressing in some of these countries later. And a big chunk also of the work of IPRI will be coordination and collaboration with indigenous peoples, regional and global networks and alliances, because IPRI is also going to build on and complement existing initiatives already. So we want to establish partnerships and collaboration with regional and global networks of indigenous peoples, and most of them will be part of the IPRI advisory group. Then collaboration and with advocate organizations and human rights bodies and institutions is also necessary, so that we optimize the avenues in the human rights advocacy and gain the broadest support of other human rights organizations. And this would, of course, include relevant human rights UN bodies, as well as national human rights institutions and other regional formations. Then as Vicky has mentioned, the establishment of a legal and sanctuary support fund. And we are already receiving requests. So this fund will soon be operationalized. We're still finalizing the guideline to make it as simple as possible in terms of procedures, but that we are also able to ensure that the funds are used in a properly, and and all cases are properly documented as well. So with these components, the key activities that IPRI will be doing is, of course, the documentation, research, and reporting of human rights violations, well, focusing on the criminalization to national, regional, and global levels. And second is the generation of attention, support, and solidarity through petition letters, call for actions, communications, and other advocacy activities. Then we will also be producing timely reports and communication materials. We will be networking with media and collaborating with other relevant NGOs. We'll also facilitate access to justice or legal remedies by victims and their families as much as we can, and to generate all types of support to indigenous human rights defenders and communities at risk, provide support to community actions and mobilizations in defense of indigenous people's rights, and engagement with the private sector and other relevant actors, particularly those that are involved in violating the rights of indigenous peoples, or at least on the positive light, those that are committing to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. We will also be helping victims use accountability mechanisms where possible and effective. And finally, to also participate in relevant events to bring this issue of indigenous peoples, and to do networking and collaboration. So in a nutshell, that's what IPRI will be doing. Now, where are we in this? So as Vicky has mentioned, we are already legally registered in the Philippines. We also have now, so that is already given. We also have set up the global board of directors, and it's my pleasure to mention the members of the board of IPRI, and these are Mr. Pavel Ziga from Russia, and many of indigenous leaders know him. I'm happy that Lars Anders is with us. He will be talking later. Also Sandra Krim, Lars Anders is a Sami leader, and he's a member of the Sami parliament. And we also have Miss Sandra Creamer from, she's an indigenous lawyer from Australia. And she is also with the International Indigenous Women's Forum. We have Ruka Sombulingi from Indonesia, who's the Secretary General of AMAN. Then we have Professor Wilfredo Alangi. He's actually the chairperson of the Philippine board of IPRI. He's a professor in the University of the Philippines. We also have Ms. Naomi Kipuri from Kenya. Then it's me and Vicky as ex-officio members of the board of IPRI. So at the moment, we're going to still get another member from North America, because when originally we approached the former Special Rapporteur James Anaya, but he said that he would take a break at this time of first, so he cannot join us at this round of members of the board. So that's the board of IPRI. We just had our meeting, and it will soon approve and adopt the documents of pertinent documents of IPRI. We will soon also establish the IPRI advisory group that this month in August, and many the members of the advisory group will come from human rights organizations, but I also mentioned earlier indigenous organizations and networks, and those coming from the focus countries of IPRI. Then we also have from advocates and other influential leaders that are strongly supporting indigenous people's rights. So the advisory group of IPRI will convene every year to provide advice on the strategies and work of IPRI in general. So so that's on the board and the advisory. Now we have already formed the IPRI Global Secretariat, which is based in Baguio. We have already the program staff. We have the communication, advocacy, and research, and also the global operations manager. We have the IT person and finance and admin staff. So we're more or less already with the staff to implement the plans of IPRI. Now at the national, so in terms of the program, as I mentioned already, we have the website, and we will soon present the new website by August 20. The new website, along with the new reports, will be put in the website. Now on the partners at the focus countries in India, we already have the report, national report on criminalization and COVID they have done, and at the moment a research team has been created to do a research on the criminalization of indigenous peoples in law and practice. And then after that will be submitted in October, and then by November will be the national workshop to discuss this and how to strategize and make the campaign plan to address the worsening criminalization in India. In the Philippines, there's the report also on COVID-19 and criminalization is already in its final stage of I mean, the draft has already been done. It's being finalized now. And we have formed a steering committee to conduct the national consultation and strategy meetings early, the final one. So there will be a series of consultations with indigenous organizations. And then the final national strategy meeting will take place next month. I'm also happy to say that in DRC or the Democratic Republic of Congo, we're able to now have the partner. It's the I don't know how to say it in French, but it's the National Alliance of Indigenous Peoples, ANAPAC. In the Democratic Republic of Congo. They have also done already the research, the report on COVID-19 and criminalization, and they're planning for the national consultation, because that's we wanted to make sure that in the focus countries there will be national consultations for them to make their strategies and campaign plans, so that we will be able so that it's clear what are the priorities at the national level and what can be the role and contribution of IPRI. This is also to mention that IPRI will be supporting full-time staff to work with partners at the national level and coordinate the research and documentation that is taking place, including advocacy at the national level. So we are also in the process of recruiting all the national staff as coordinators of IPRI in the 6 countries. So finally, to mention that IPRI was able to secure funding, and I would like to extend our appreciation to the donors of IPRI. We have the GIZ, which is the German Development Cooperation. We have Ford Foundation, and we have Niatero contributing to IPRI for a period of from now to next year, and hopefully beyond. And that's also the reason why we're able to get the staff and already do the initial work at the country level. So far, sorry, I took some time, but I would like to end there, and later I will be presenting the findings of the, presenting briefly the mid-year report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Thank you, Joanne and Vicky, for sharing with us a brief overview of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. So the question now is, what then is the significance of this organization to Indigenous peoples and to the organizations on the ground? We'll have two speakers who will be sharing on situation of Indigenous peoples in their respective countries, and then probably connecting this to the global situation. Our first speaker on this is Sandra Kramer. She is an Wani Kalkadun Indigenous woman from Australia. Sandra is the CEO of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance. She's a lawyer and adjunct professor in public health at the University of Queensland. Sandra was awarded a member of the Order of Australia Award on the Queen's birthday in 2019 for her work with Indigenous women and peoples. Sandra is an advisor for the 7th Generation Board Fund, on the board of the International Indigenous Women's Forum, and on the advisory team for the Queensland Human Rights Commissioner. She's also a board member of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. Sandra has been involved with the international arena for many years, and in particular, working and attending the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, and she was co-chair for the Global Indigenous Women's Caucus. So Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be on the board and speaking here today. I'd like to acknowledge all Indigenous peoples on their lands and territories who are listening to this. Violent attacks and criminalisation has increased against Indigenous peoples. These issues affect Indigenous peoples globally. It is important to have this organisation, Indigenous Peoples Rights International, for the purposes it stands for and for Indigenous peoples to stand together. Our human rights protections and laws are being stripped away, even though they are there to protect us, and instead of those laws being enforced and holding criminal accountability, blind eyes are being turned, or Indigenous people are being treated as criminals. Indigenous land defenders, peoples, communities are being threatened, bullied, harassed, illegally surveillanced, forced disappearance, blackmailed, sexual assault, criminalised and put in prison, or even murdered. We also face terror campaigns on a daily basis that aim to silence our voices. It's very concerning for all Indigenous peoples. The vast majority of Indigenous peoples who are committing crimes against Indigenous peoples are never brought to justice. I will discuss a small section on Australians' issue. In Australia, the government legally recognises and protects some of the rights of Indigenous peoples. However, systematic racism and discrimination against Indigenous peoples persist. Where the rights have been recognised from international human rights instruments, the Australian and state governments continually find ways to water down the extent of our rights when they ratify the instruments into domestic legislations. They also find ways to use positive laws for our protection against us. A classic example is how the Commonwealth Government suspended the operation of our Racial Discrimination Act to undertake the Northern Territory intervention for land use of Aboriginal peoples in that territory. While we do not have a federal Human Rights Act, most of our states have chosen to enact state-based Human Rights Act. The rights of Indigenous peoples are limited and does not reflect or take into account those in the UN DRIP. This is reflected in the drafting of our Native Title Land Act and other legislations that address land rights in Australia. Another example is played out into deaths in custody across the Australia and as well as coroner's reports, where Aboriginal people are arrested for minor offences and have died within 72 hours of being arrested or at the time of arrest while they are in the hands of custody, in the custody of the police. On a death, Aboriginal peoples and families will be told by the police, "We are preparing a report for the coroner," which really means they are conducting a second-rate investigation, which will then limit a coroner's ability to make findings. This is because the coroner's fact-finding process is substantially reliant upon the set of facts which are collected by the police in their own investigations upon a death. In any event, a coroner is unlikely to consider making a finding until years later, long after critical evidence has been lost or forgotten. One of the biggest challenges that our human rights defenders face is the systematic racism that exists within all levels of government. It is difficult for our rights to be protected when our society doesn't understand our history and therefore the intergenerational effects that history has on us today. The stats in Australia where we sit in society tell this story. While many of our states and big corporates say they are willing to work through these issues, their actions do not reflect this. Our latest report, The Closing of the Gap in Australia, the stats demonstrate that generally across the board, the gap is widening and not closing. This is largely due to the continued fact that the government and industries believe that they know best and that we are not capable of developing our own systems or process that will achieve outcomes. Violence against Indigenous women has reached high levels, though data is limited to give the true stats on these. This is why this organisation is important. Stats define the scales of the problems, but they do not convey the experience of violence and criminalisations against Indigenous women and peoples and communities and land defenders, as well as what is happening to them on their lands and the impact that is having on them as survivors. Being on the FEMI board and the leadership school where we bring Indigenous women together at the United Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, since May 2015, more than 140 Indigenous women have been empowered in Bolivia, Peru, India, Philippines, Panama, El Salvador, the Pacific, Paraguay, and this is to name just a few of the countries. These women who come from remote areas, for some, being the first time they go out to their communities, get together to learn, share their problems and challenges and reflect on how to advocate to improve their situations. We have had women in the school who speak about the persecutions they suffer in their communities. This organisation, Indigenous Peoples Rights International, is a need for Indigenous women, peoples to lead a global campaign to provide confidence to them and looking at how we can make it safe so they can have a voice without fear. Thank you.
Sandra, for sharing information on Indigenous peoples in Australia and giving a global perspective on the situation of Indigenous women. For our next speaker, we have Lars Anders. He is a Sami and reindeer herder from Sweden. He served as the president of the Sami Parliament in Sweden and chairperson of the Union of the Swedish Sami. As a member of the Sami Council, Lars was involved in the Pan-Sami movement in the early 1970s and served as the chairperson of the council when the Sami population in Russia was integrated into the Pan-Sami movement during the Glasnost period at the end of the 1980s. As a key figure in the Sami Council, he was also involved in setting up the Development Aid Program, which is an indigenous to indigenous program in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and in the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations. He was also involved as NGO representative and expert in government delegation when the International Labor Organization revised Convention number 107 and replaced it with Convention number 169. He was engaged in indigenous-related matters in the UN system, such as the World Intellectual Property Organization and the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. He is also a member of the Global Board of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. So Lars, I'm giving you now the floor.
Brief to start with a general overview about recent development, and then a little bit about what is going on in the Nordic context or in the Sami area. And finally, some comments about some recent work that I've been involved in, and that's about a report made by the Oecd, the Organization of Economic and Cooperation and Development, that was published last year. One report is 8 country reports and then one global report. To start with, to look back, if you look on the indigenous movement, international indigenous movements that started to emerge in the 1970s, in the beginning of 1970s, we can look back and see that the indigenous people have been quite skillful to cooperate and also to use the international politics and covenants to frame their matters. And we have also navigated in a quite a difficult geopolitical environment over the years. We had the Cold War that created a lot of problems for the indigenous peoples movement. We can see the situation, the civil wars in Central America. We can also see in other areas in Africa and Asia. So, but even even in that reality, we managed to lift up the indigenous matters on the international field in the UN. But as you know, the geopolitical situation has changed a lot, and now we have this COVID-19 pandemic, and the outcome of that is difficult to predict. But it's also going to affect, in many ways, the indigenous cooperation. Not only the situation of many indigenous peoples that are really in a very rough situation now. We can see the situation in Brazil, for instance, and how this will affect the indigenous peoples movement is difficult to predict. We can also see that the dynamics in the global discussion between the big powers is also quite unpredictable. We have US, we have China now getting stronger, getting involved in much more issues, also affecting, of course, indigenous peoples. So there is a quite new global geopolitical situation that we have to adapt, and I think we need to discuss in what way we can manage to forward indigenous matters in this new context. But I'm as usually, I'm quite optimistic, and if we look back, we have succeeded quite well. And one of the key issues is cooperation over the borders. And as a Sami person, we, as you know, we are living in 4 countries, and our areas has also been divided in way back between big geopolitical forces, and there is still so that we have Samis on the Russian side, Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and this has forced us to work cross-border, and that's without that we hadn't managed to promote them Sami issues at all. So I think it's quite important that we look for new ways to cooperate, taking account that the political and the geopolitical situation in the world is changing, and many indigenous people are still in a quite a tough situation. If you look on the Scandinavian countries, or the Sweden, Finland, Norway, we are defined as welfare states. And if you look on the statistics, even if there is a lack of statistics about indigenous peoples in these three countries, the situation, because we are living in welfare stage, the education level among Samis is quite good. The livelihood situation among Samis is almost at the same average as the other citizens in these countries. So in that sense, we are quite a privileged people if you compare with other indigenous peoples. But in the bitter end, we are facing the same problems as other indigenous peoples. Of course, with less violence, some kind of a rule of law in this country. So this means that we have, of course, better opportunities to promote our issues. But still, there is a lot of issues that we are facing. One, as I said, one of the main problems is that we are living in 4 countries, and this means that we need to have a close cooperation between the countries where we are living in. And today, the cooperation between Sweden, Finland, Norway is quite advanced, and this has been since the end of the Second World War. We have cooperation in different fields. And this has been a big advantage for the Sami movement. So today we can freely cross the borders, we can freely work on each side of the borders, and we can also study in the universities in all these 3 countries. Even the situation on the Russian side is proving. We have many Russian Samis who are studying and also working on the Swedish, Finnish, on the Norwegian side, and the cooperation is still running quite well, even if there is changes in the system if you compare the Nordic countries with Russia. So there is still a lot of challenges ahead. And we can also see there is a lot of international, regional cooperation. We have the Barents Council, we have the Arctic Council. So there are a lot of issues going on in the Arctic. But then we have the climate change that is affecting the Arctic and the indigenous peoples very heavily. We can see the situation, especially on the Russian side. We have reports about the climate change affecting the permafrost and the climate as a whole. And we can also see it very clearly for those who work in the reindeer herding business, because it is mainly based on a predictable climate, and the climate is unpredictable. And the problem with the process is also that the international climate discussions are quite unpredictable, and it seems to be that the cooperation now has almost stalled, but hopefully this will continue. And I think there is there is no choice to do others. So as concluding, I only want to mention this OECD report, and you can see this one. This is the international report about some of the OECD country members, among them US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and also Sweden they have made regional reports in each country. And then they have also a global report where also countries as Peru and Colombia are involved. And the aim of the project is to look upon linking indigenous communities with regional development, because I think also that this is quite important for the indigenous peoples to be part of the economic, to benefit of the economic in each country, and also have the right to develop their own economic system based on land rights and so on. So I think I stop there. This regional report is, you can find it on the OECD report, OECD website. And the problem now with this report is that the COVID-19 pandemic has created some problem with the implementation of the report. But hopefully this will continue after the COVID has diminished. So over and out.
Thank you so much, Lars. So what we have done so far is to share about the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, its objectives, its purpose, its programs. And we have, this is more emphasized, the significance of this organization is more emphasized by the sharing of situations of Indigenous peoples on the ground and the regional and the global level, which was done by Sandra and Lars. I would like to remind the